Welcome to the 28th video in our series of quilts and projects using 2.5-inch strips or jelly rolls. I'm using a pattern by Moda called Chain of Fools for this month's project. I was also hoping I could use up this entire bag of yellow 2.5-inch strips. The pattern uses a light background and dark strips. I'm going to flip the values and use a dark background with light strips. The strips in the yellow bag were anything from a light yellow color to a deep gold color. I looked for darker fabrics that had a little bit of yellow in them, and then I laid the yellow strips across the bolts to see which one I thought would look the best. I had a lot of really great options, and it was really hard to decide which one would be the best for the background, knowing that I would have to chop some of it into smaller pieces for the pattern. I could also have chosen a plainer fabric, but I knew I wanted mine to be a little bit busier in the background to kind of hide the seams where the backgrounds will be. Honestly, any of these fabrics would have worked, and ultimately I picked the fabric that had a black background and then had the candy and pretzels all over it, just for a little whimsical fun. Before we start sewing, we need to cut the background fabric. Cut 16 strips that are 2.5 inches by the width of fabric. You will want to set aside 8 of these strips to use for the outer border, and then the remaining 8 strips you will cut in half on the fold to get 16 strips that are 2.5 inches by about 21 inches. You also need to cut 4 strips that are 10.5 inches by the width of fabric. From these strips, you need to cut 24 rectangles that are 6.5 inches by 10.5 inches. I like to layer my strips so I can cut multiple pieces at once. Just make sure that before you cut, you are on the right measurement. For the background fabric for this quilt, you need a total of 3¼ yards. I'm also using the same fabric for my binding, so I need another 3/4 yard for that, so a grand total of 4 yards. The pattern also directs you to cut 3 strips that are 6.5 inches by the width of fabric. Cut each of these pieces on the fold to get 6 strips that are 6.5 inches by about 21 inches. Now that we're done cutting our background fabric, it's time to sew. Please use 1/4-inch seam allowances. The entire quilt top is made of 2 blocks, Block A and Block B. We're going to start with Block A. Block A is made from 3 different strip sets. For strip set 1, I need 7 background strips, which is the black fabric, and 28 print strips, which is the yellow fabrics. I'm going to sew 2 yellow strips to each side of my background strip. Not all of my yellow strips were 21 inches long, so a few of my background strips I cut down to fit the yellow strips that I had available. I also could have sewn yellow strips together end to end to make them long enough to go on to the side of the background fabric. I just kept sewing until I had 5 strips across with the background strip in the center. You can press after you add each of the strips to your strip set. I chose to do all the sewing first and press all the seams at the end. If you do decide to press as you go, make sure that all your seams go in one direction. The only thing I tried to keep track of here was that I was not sewing the same fabric onto each side of the strip set, and also mixing up the values of the yellows so I had darks and lights together in one strip set. Mixing up the yellows really well will give the quilt a little bit of sparkle and help your eyes dance around the quilt looking at all the different fabrics. If you would like a printed version of this pattern, look for the link in the description below that will take you right to the pattern and you can print it at home. For my quilt, I'm just using leftover strips from other projects, but you could also use your stash. Once all your pieces are sewn, it's time to head to the ironing board to press. Press all of the seams in one direction. You will want to do this for all of your strip sets. I will usually press these strip sets from the wrong side first, and then I'll flip it over to the front side to make sure I haven't pressed any creases into the seams. You can always add some Mary Ellen's Best Press spray if your seams or fabrics need convincing to lay flat. Once your strip sets are all pressed, it's time to head to the cutting mat. Subcut all of the strip sets into 2.5-inch wide segments. Each of these segments should measure 2.5 inches by 10.5 inches. You will need a total of 50 of these subcuts. I like to stack my strip sets, offsetting the seams so that they're not one on top of each other. That way it's a little bit easier to cut. I trim one edge even, and then I use my square ruler cutting at the 12.5 inch, 10, 7.5 inch, 5, and 2.5 inch markings. It's important as you're cutting to double check the measurement that you are on to make sure it's correct. If I were to make a mistake on these cuts, one mistake would actually be 3 mistakes because I have 3 layers stacked up. If you are not confident cutting multiple strip sets at once, you absolutely can do one strip set at a time. It might take a little longer, but you'll get the job done. Once you're done cutting, you should have at least 50 subcuts that are 2.5 inches by 10.5 inches. Now it's time to work on strip set 2 for block A. Strip set 2 is made of 5 assorted print strips, so I'll be using 5 yellow strips to make these strip sets. Not all of my strip sets were 21 inches long. They varied in length, and I just tried to find yellow strips that were the same length to sew together. I saved my longest strips for strip set 1 and strip set 3. I used all the leftover smaller pieces to make the strip sets for strip set 2. As I was sewing the yellow fabrics together, I tried to make sure to mix up the colors a little bit so I had light and dark yellows sewn together and the patterns of the designs as well. Occasionally, when I was sewing the 5 yellow strips together to make the strip set for strip set 2, I would have the same fabric in that strip set, but I decided to let that go because as long as they weren't right next to each other, it wasn't going to hurt anything. You can press as you go along, as long as you press all the seams in one direction, or you can wait to the end and have all 5 strips sewn together to press everything at once. If you don't have leftover strips from other projects to make this quilt, you could always cut fat quarters up or fat eighths up. You would need about 10 fat quarters or 20 fat eighths cut into strips 2.5 inches by 21 inches to have enough to make this quilt. Once you're done pressing, it's time to head to the cutting mat. Subcut the strip sets into sections that are 2.5 inches wide. You will need a total of 50 segments that are 2.5 inches by 10.5 inches. You can subcut one strip set at a time, or you can layer sections and subcut multiple units at once. I'm using my yellow fabric strips and a dark background with a little bit of yellow in it for my quilt, but I think this quilt pattern would work with a lot of different color combinations. It'd be great in holiday prints, Christmas or Halloween, or pick a favorite color and make that the basis for the chains in the quilt and another fabric color that you like for the background. Now that that's done, it's time to work on strip set 3. Strip set 3 is made with 3 assorted print strips in the center and the background strips on each end. I started by sewing a yellow strip to each of my background strips, and I had 6 background strips. Next, you need to add another print strip to 3 of those units, so I'm sewing another yellow onto 3 of the units. Now sew the sets that you set aside to these units. You should have 3 prints in the center with the background strips on opposite sides of the 3 center pieces. Press all of the seams in one direction. Subcut the strip sets into sections that are 2.5 inches wide. The measurements of these segments will be 2.5 inches by 10.5 inches. You should be able to get at least 24 segments from these strip sets. You will actually need 25 of these sections for the quilt top for the 25 blocks we're making. Use leftover pieces from other strip sets to make one more section. I did a double count here to make sure that I had the correct number of segments I needed from each of the strip sets. Strip set 1, you need 50, strip set 2, you need 50, and strip set 3, you need 25. If you are missing any of these pieces, you can always make 1 or 2 segments using squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches of the correct colors you need to make the configuration you need. Start by sewing the strip set 2 units to opposite sides of the strip set 3 units. You should be able to nest all the seams together, so if the seams are facing the same way, just turn one of the units the other way and all of those seams will nest. You should be sewing all of your units exactly the same. As I was sewing these units together, the only thing I tried not to do was to sew like fabrics next to each other. I know there were a few times where they ended up that way, and I decided that was okay. I did decide that when I was sewing the blocks together, I did want to press as I went along. That way things would lay a little flatter at the end. When you add the next section on, it's important that you're sewing it to the side of the unit that has the background fabric. Make sure that you're not sewing all print strips to each other. So in my case, I had to make sure I wasn't sewing all yellow squares to all yellow squares. If you're paying close enough attention, hopefully you won't have to get your seam ripper out. For the blocks, we're also going to press so that our seams all go in one direction. Next, we're going to add the strip set 1 sections to opposite sides of the center unit. When these 25 blocks are done, you should have a background square in the center of each side of the block. Make sure the seams are nesting together as you add each section on. I'm going to sew the last section onto this unit before I head over to the ironing board. Let us know in the comment section below whether you think this is a good pattern for leftover strips or if it'd be better suited for a jelly roll. Also, don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you're enjoying our series using 2.5-inch strips. Once pressed, these blocks should measure 10.5 inches by 10.5 inches. Make sure all of your seams are pressed in one direction. You can press from the back side and then check the front to make sure you haven't pressed in any creases, or you can press from the front and make sure all your seams are going in one direction. You should have a grand total of 25 blocks measuring 10.5 inches square. Now it's time to work on block B. Start by sewing the 2.5 inch by 21 inch print strips onto opposite sides of the 6.5 inch by 21 inch background strips. You will need a total of 6 of these units. Press both of these seams in the same direction. Subcut the strip sets into sections that are 2.5 inches wide. You will need a total of 48 segments measuring 2.5 inches by 10.5 inches. Piece the 2.5 inch wide strip set segments onto opposite sides of the 6.5 inch by 10.5 inch background rectangles. Make 24 of these blocks. Once pressed, these blocks will measure 10.5 inches by 10.5 inches. For these blocks, you can press away from the center rectangle. You should now have 25 of block A and 24 of block B. It's time to sew these together into rows. Start by setting aside 4 of the block A's and 3 of the block B's. Once those are set aside, you can take each of the block A's and sew a block B to it. Make sure that when you're sewing block B to block A, you're always sewing the segment section of block B and not the large rectangle section. Make sure to sew all sets of 2 blocks, block A and block B, the same exact way. Once you have them all sewn together, it will be time to press. Always press towards block B. You will have 21 sets of these 2 blocks sewn together. Now you can either lay out your rows as you want to change things around and make sure you have the different fabrics spread out amongst the quilt, or you can just randomly start sewing them together and hope for the best. We'll bring back those blocks that we set aside, and then we are going to make 7 rows of 7 blocks. 4 of the rows will start and finish with block A. 3 of the rows will start and finish with block B. I sewed the rows that had the block B blocks on both ends first, just so it helped me keep track of things a little bit easier. As you sew your rows together and press, Continue to press towards block B. Once your rows are finished and pressed, you can start sewing the rows to each other. I found that most of the seams were nesting together, but occasionally there would be one that would go the opposite direction, and then I would carefully pin that so that I didn't have to worry about making a gap where the seams would meet. If you want to lay your rows out before you start sewing them together, just to make sure you don't have fabrics that match lining up to each other, you can do that, but I just sewed the random rows together without looking until I was sewing right over the top of it. Honestly, I was surprised I didn't have more matching pieces being sewn to each other. I must have had just the right amount of variety in my strips. You can press as you go as you sew these seams, or you can press just once at the end before you add your borders. I chose to wait till the end and press just once to get all those seams done across the whole quilt top. I was getting kind of anxious to see how the quilt top was going to turn out, so I just wanted to keep on sewing. Once all the rows are sewn together and the quilt top is pressed, it should measure 70.5 inches by 70.5 inches. The pattern calls for adding side borders and borders to the top and bottom to get a 2-inch border all the way around the quilt top. But if you like it just the way it is right now, you could just quilt it and bind it. I am very happy with the way it turned out, but I did decide I wanted to add that border that was the same fabric as the background fabric. And I was so close to using up all of the yellow fabric that I decided to sew it end to end together and then add one more border of yellow all the way around the whole quilt. And when I add the binding that's the same as the background fabric, it's going to make that yellow border pop. I used a flannel back and warm and natural for my batting and quilted this on my long arm quilting machine. I used a soft yellow thread for the quilting thread on the top and for the back of the quilt. I used a larger stipple design for the quilting pattern, and I love the way it blends into the quilt and you can hardly even see it, especially when you step back a little ways. And the black binding around the edge is the perfect finish to the quilt top. The flannel fabric that I picked for the back is a cat design, and they're all kind of just scattered all around, and it's kind of a fun design that I thought went very well with the whimsical fabric that's on the front. I'm very pleased with how this quilt turned out, especially since I'm not a very big fan of yellow fabric, but in this case, I'm going to make an exception. I can't believe we're 28 videos into using up my scrap pile. So this is how it started, and now we're down to one bucket, and this is how it's going. It's nice to see some of these fabrics being used up. We hope you remember to give us a thumbs up if you liked the video, leave a comment for us, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!